The sound of her own crying echoed down the stone corridor, and Elena pressed her palm against her mouth to muffle it, but it was too late. The guards had already heard her. She could see them standing near the tall oak doors of the throne room, their eyes flicking toward her for only a second, before turning away again, pretending they had not noticed. That was the worst part. Everyone pretended. Everyone in this castle had learned how to look away from her pain, as if it were something shameful, something that belonged only to her and had nothing to do with the man who caused it. She slid down against the cold wall, her silk dress pooling around her knees, and let the tears fall freely, now that she had stopped trying to hide them. 3 years of being called Luna, of wearing a crown that meant nothing, of sharing a bed with a man who barely looked at her. She had told herself so many times that it would get better, that Damien would soften, that the bond between them would grow the way the elders always promised it would. But promises meant nothing to a king who had already decided his mate was beneath his attention. Inside the throne room, Damien sat with his broad shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the maps spread across the long table before him. Serafina stood close beside him, closer than any beta commander needed to stand, her fingers tapping against the wood as she spoke about border patrols and enemy movement. She was sharp, capable, and undeniably beautiful, and she never let an opportunity pass to remind the room of it. A young guard named Oliver leaned toward the king and spoke in a low voice. "My king, the Luna is crying in the hallway again." Damien did not lift his eyes from the map. His jaw tightened, the only sign that he had heard the words at all. "Let her cry," he said, his voice flat and cold as winter stone, and then he continued speaking to Serafina, as though nothing had been said at all. Oliver hesitated, glancing toward the door as if he wanted to say something more, but one look at the king's expression told him it would be useless. He stepped back into his place along the wall and said nothing else. Outside, Elena had heard every word through the thick door, her wolf senses sharper than any human's could ever be. She had heard it before, more times than she cared to count, but tonight it cut deeper than usual. Tonight she had gone to him with something important, something she had been trying to say for weeks, and he had dismissed her before she even finished her first sentence. Then he had told her he had no time for her worries, that the pack's safety came first, that whatever she needed to say could wait. It could not wait. That was the terrible truth she carried inside her chest like a stone. Her wolf had been growing weaker for months now, and she did not know how to explain it to him without sounding foolish, without giving Serafina another reason to whisper about her weakness to the pack elders. So she had tried to tell him gently, carefully, and he had simply waved her away like a servant interrupting an important meeting. She pushed herself up from the floor and wiped her face with the back of her hand, forcing her spine straight the way her mother had taught her long ago, before her parents had been lost in a border conflict that still haunted her dreams. A Luna did not crumble in hallways where anyone could see. She walked, slow and steady, toward her private chambers at the far end of the east wing, away from the throne room, away from the sound of Serafina's laughter drifting faintly through the walls. Her chambers were beautiful, in the way that empty things are beautiful. Tall windows looked out over the training grounds, where young wolves practiced their forms under the moonlight. A large bed sat untouched on one side of the room, its blankets always neatly folded, because Damien rarely came to share it anymore. She had a small writing desk near the window, where she kept a journal that no one else had ever read, filled with thoughts she was too afraid to speak aloud. Clara, her personal attendant, and the closest thing she had to a true friend within these walls, was waiting for her when she entered. Clara took one look at her tear-streaked face and did not ask questions. She simply guided Elena to the chair by the window and began brushing out her long dark hair, the way she always did when words felt too heavy to use. "He said it again, didn't he?" Clara finally said, her voice gentle. "Let her cry." Elena closed her eyes. "He doesn't even look at me when he says it anymore. It's like I've become background noise to him, something he doesn't have to think about." "You are the Luna of this kingdom," Clara said firmly. "You deserve better than being treated like a shadow in your own home. Deserving something and receiving it are not the same thing," Elena whispered. "I learned that a long time ago." Clara set the brush down and knelt in front of her, taking both of Elena's hands in hers. "Did you tell him about the shifts? About what's been happening to you?" Elena shook her head slowly. "I tried. He didn't let me finish. He thinks I only wanted his attention. that I was making up excuses to interrupt his meeting with her. Clara's expression darkened at the mention of Serafina, but she said nothing more about it, sensing that Elena did not have the strength for that conversation tonight. Instead, she asked, "How bad has it gotten?" Elena hesitated before answering. It was strange to say it out loud, to give the fear a real shape with real words. Every time I shift now, it feels like something inside me is fighting against itself, like my wolf doesn't want to come out anymore, or like she's too tired to keep trying. It used to feel like flying, Clara. Now it feels like drowning. Clara's eyes widened slightly, worry flashing across her face before she carefully smoothed it away, not wanting to frighten Elena further. "Have you spoken to Margaret about this? She has served this pack as healer for 40 years. If anyone would understand what's happening, it would be her." "I was going to see her tomorrow," Elena admitted. "I wanted to tell Damien first, in case it was something serious. I didn't want him to hear it from someone else and think I was hiding things from him. And instead, he wouldn't even hear it from you," Clara said softly, shaking her head. "Sometimes I don't understand that man. He was not always this cold, Elena. I remember him from before, when his father still ruled. He used to laugh. He used to notice things." "That man is gone," Elena said, staring out the window toward the dark line of trees beyond the training grounds. "Whatever happened to him before I arrived here, it changed him into someone who doesn't know how to let anyone close, not even his own mate." Neither of them spoke of it directly, but both women were aware of the rumors that lived quietly among the older pack members, whispered only when they thought no one important was listening. Before Elena had come to the kingdom, before the bond had chosen her, Damien had loved someone else, a woman named Isolde, the daughter of an allied pack, who had promised him loyalty and had instead sold pack secrets to their enemies, for a price no one ever fully understood. The betrayal had nearly cost Damien his throne, and it had certainly cost him something far more personal. Since then, he had built walls so high and so thick that even his own fated mate could not find a way through them. Elena understood, in some quiet corner of her heart, why he might struggle to trust again. But understanding did not soften the loneliness of sleeping alone every night, of eating meals in silence while he discussed pack matters with Serafina at the other end of the table, of being told to let her cry, rather than being asked why she was crying at all. She stood from the chair and walked to the window, resting her forehead against the cool glass. But below, in the training yard, she could see young wolves shifting under Oliver's supervision, their forms rippling and changing with an ease that made her chest ache with envy. She remembered when her own shifts had felt that effortless, that joyful. Now every change left her breathless and shaking, hidden away in her chambers, where no one could see how much it had begun to cost her. "Promise me something," Clara said, coming to stand beside her. "What is it?" "Promise me you'll actually go to Margaret tomorrow. Not next week. Not when you find a better moment. Tomorrow. Whatever is happening to you. It sounds serious. And I would rather you tell me you were being overly cautious than have you hide something dangerous because you were too proud to ask for help." Elena managed a small, tired smile. "You sound like my mother." "Someone has to look after you," Clara said, "since it seems the king has forgotten how." The words hung in the air between them, honest and a little bit dangerous to speak inside these walls, but Elena did not correct her. She simply nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as a cool breeze slipped through the cracked window. "I promise," she said. "Tomorrow, I'll see her." Later that night, long after Clara had gone and the castle had grown quiet, Elena lay awake in her wide, empty bed, staring up at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. She thought about the early days after the bond had first connected them, when Damien had looked at her with something that almost resembled wonder, before Serafina's influence had grown, before whatever pain lived inside him had risen up and shut every door between them. She wondered, not for the first time, if there had ever truly been a chance for them at all, or if she had simply been dropped into the middle of a story that had already ended before she arrived. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the sadness and the exhaustion, her wolf stirred weakly, as if trying to reassure her that everything would be fine. But the reassurance felt thinner than it used to, more like a whisper than a promise, and Elena found herself wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, exactly how much longer that whisper would last. Across the castle, in his private study, Damien stood by the fireplace long after Serafina had finally left him alone. The maps were rolled and set aside now, the pack business finished for the night. And yet he did not go to his own chambers. He stood staring into the flames, his mind circling back, unwillingly, to the sound of crying that had followed him down the hallway earlier. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself that a king could not afford to be softened by tears, that every ounce of weakness he allowed himself would be used against him by someone, somewhere, the way it had been used against him once before. He told himself all of this, and yet some small, buried part of him kept replaying the sound of her voice, kept wondering what exactly she had been trying to tell him before he had cut her off. He pushed the thought away, the way he pushed away every thought that threatened to crack the careful control he had built around himself. There would be time for such things later, he told himself. There was always time later. He did not yet understand how wrong he was, or how little time was actually left before everything he had refused to hear would come crashing down around him, impossible to ignore any longer. Morning came with a pale gray light that filtered through the curtains of Elena's chambers, and she woke feeling more tired than when she had gone to sleep. Her limbs ached in a way that had nothing to do with any physical labor, a deep bone tiredness that had become familiar to her over the past several months. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand against her chest as if she could somehow steady whatever was shifting and cracking inside her. Clara arrived shortly after, with a tray of tea and fruit, setting it down on the small table near the window. "You look pale," she said, studying Elena's face with open concern. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little," Elena admitted, though the truth was closer to almost none. "I keep thinking about what Margaret might tell me. Part of me is afraid to hear it." "Then it is better to know than to keep wondering in silence," Clara said, handing her a cup of tea. "Fear grows larger in the dark. Bring it into the light, and it often shrinks." Elena wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for its heat against her cold fingers. "I want to believe that." They walked together through the quieter halls of the castle, avoiding the main corridors where pack members gathered in the mornings to receive their daily assignments. Elena had learned, over the years, which paths kept her out of Serafina's sight, which routes let her move through her own home, without feeling like she was being watched and judged by someone who wanted nothing more than to see her fail. Margaret's quarters were tucked into the oldest part of the castle, near the herb gardens that had been tended by healers for generations before her. The old woman was already awake when they arrived, sorting dried plants into small clay jars with hands that moved with practiced precision, despite the slight tremor of age. "Luna," Margaret said, looking up with a warm but knowing expression, as though she had been expecting this visit for some time. "Come, sit. You have not been sleeping well, I think." "How did you know?" Elena asked, settling onto the wooden stool across from her. "An old healer learns to read faces the way others read books," Margaret said simply. "Tell me what troubles you." Elena hesitated only a moment before the words began spilling out, faster than she had planned, as if some dam inside her had finally broken. She described the exhaustion that never seemed to lift no matter how much she rested, the way her wolf felt increasingly distant during her waking hours, and most frightening of all, the pain that had begun accompanying every shift, a pain that grew sharper and lasted longer each time. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every word, until finally she set down the jar in her hands and reached for Elena's wrist, pressing gentle fingers against the pulse point there. She closed her eyes for a long moment, seeming to listen to something beneath the surface that only a healer trained in the old ways could sense. "How long has this been happening?" Margaret finally asked. "Almost 5 months," Elena said quietly. "It started small. I thought it was simply stress, or perhaps not eating enough, or not sleeping properly. But it has gotten steadily worse, and now I am afraid to shift at all, because each time feels like it takes something away from me that does not come back." Margaret released her wrist and sat back, her weathered face troubled in a way that made Elena's stomach twist with dread. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer is painful." "Of course." "How would you describe your bond with the king? Not the title, not the ceremony that made you Luna, but the actual connection between your souls. Do you feel it? Does it feel warm, alive, growing, or has it felt distant, cold, perhaps even fading?" Elena's throat tightened at the question, tears threatening to rise again, even though she had promised herself she would not cry in front of Margaret. It has felt distant for a long time now. In the beginning, I could feel him, even when he wasn't near me, like a warmth in the back of my mind. But lately, that warmth has grown so faint, I sometimes wonder if I am imagining it entirely. Margaret nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. There is an old condition among our kind, Luna, one that is rarely spoken of, because it is rarely seen in modern packs, where bonds are usually nurtured with care. It happens when a mate bond forms fully on one side, but remains unreciprocated or neglected on the other. For a long enough period of time, the wolf, which draws much of its strength from that connection, begins to weaken, slowly, at first, and then more rapidly, as the imbalance continues. "Are you saying that Damien's indifference is making me sick?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am saying that the bond itself is suffering, and your wolf suffers with it, because a wolf's spirit and a Luna's bond are deeply intertwined," Margaret said gently. "This is not something you have done wrong, child. You have loved fully, and given everything a mate is meant to give. But a bond requires two hearts moving toward each other, not one heart reaching endlessly into empty space." Elena pressed a hand against her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that rose in her chest. "What happens if it isn't fixed? If the bond continues this way?" Margaret's silence lasted a beat too long before she answered, and that silence alone told Elena more than words could have. The wolf will continue to weaken, shifts will become more painful, more dangerous. Eventually, if nothing changes, the wolf may simply be unable to return from a shift at all. This is exceedingly rare, Luna, and it takes years to reach such a point. But the pain you describe, the fatigue, the growing distance in the bond, these are signs that you have already traveled a great distance down that path. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Elena, and Clara's hand found hers, gripping tightly, as if trying to anchor her to something solid. "There must be something that can be done," Clara said, her voice sharp with worry. "Some way to strengthen the bond, to reverse this." "There is," Margaret said, though her tone remained cautious. "The bond can be restored, if both parties choose to nurture it, to open themselves to each other fully and consistently. Genuine connection, genuine care, expressed not once, but continuously, over time, can heal even a bond that has grown this thin. But it requires the king's participation. This is not something the Luna can do alone, no matter how much love she carries in her own heart." Elena thought of the previous night, of standing outside the throne room while her tears went unanswered, of Damien's flat voice telling the guard to let her cry. The idea of asking him to nurture their bond, to open himself to her when he could not even spare her a few minutes of his attention, felt like asking the moon to fall from the sky. "He won't listen," she said quietly. "I tried last night. I tried to tell him something was wrong, and he dismissed me before I finished a single sentence." Margaret's expression softened with sympathy, but there was also a firmness in her eyes, the look of someone who had lived long enough to know that difficult truths still needed to be spoken. "Then you must find a way to make him understand the seriousness of what is happening, Luna, because I fear that pride and silence will only speed the course of this illness, not slow it. You do not have unlimited time to wait for him to notice on his own." They spoke for a while longer, Margaret providing what small remedies she could, herbal teas that might ease the physical pain of shifting and help Elena sleep more soundly, though she was honest in admitting these were treatments for symptoms, not the underlying cause. As Elena and Clara finally left the healer's quarters and made their way back through the quiet halls, Elena felt as though the weight she carried had doubled, now given a name and a shape that made it impossible to ignore any longer. "You have to tell him," Clara said as they walked. "Properly this time. Make him listen, even if you have to demand it." "And if he still refuses?" Elena asked. "If he hears the truth and still chooses to walk away, back to his meetings, back to her?" Clara did not have an answer for that, and the two women walked the rest of the way in troubled silence. Meanwhile, in a different part of the castle, Serafina moved through the war room with the confidence of someone who believed her position was becoming more secure with each passing day. She had spent months carefully working her way into Damien's trust, offering herself as an indispensable advisor on matters of pack security, always careful to frame her presence as purely strategic, purely necessary. even as she found small ways to remind him of Elena's perceived shortcomings. The Luna seemed unwell at dinner last week, she mentioned casually to Damien as they reviewed reports from the northern border. Some of the pack have begun to whisper about it. They wonder if she is fit to carry the weight of her title. Damien did not look up from the papers in front of him, though something in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The pack should focus on the border reports, not on gossip. Of course, Serafina said smoothly, allowing the seed she had planted to settle without pushing further, a tactic she had perfected over many months. She understood that overt attacks would only make Damien defensive, protective even, of a bond he did not seem to value, but might still feel obligated to defend, if pressed too openly. Subtlety was far more effective. Small comments dropped like stones into still water, allowed to ripple outward on their own. What Serafina did not know, what she could not have guessed, was that her carefully constructed campaign of doubt was working alongside a far more dangerous force, one she had no control over and no understanding of. Elena's condition was not the result of weakness or unfitness, as Serafina liked to imply. It was the direct result of neglect, a slow poison seeping from the very throne room where Serafina spent so much of her time, whispering into the ear of a king who had forgotten how to listen to the one voice that mattered most. That evening, Elena gathered her courage and made her way once more toward the throne room, determined to say what needed to be said, regardless of who might be listening. She found Damien alone this time, standing at the tall windows overlooking the training grounds, his broad shoulders outlined against the fading light of dusk. "Damien," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to speak with you. It cannot wait any longer." He turned slightly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I am listening," he said, though something in his tone suggested he expected another complaint, another minor grievance he did not have the patience for. Elena took a breath and began, choosing her words carefully this time, determined not to let him dismiss her before she finished. What she told him about the exhaustion, about the pain in her shifts, about her visit to Margaret that morning, and everything the old healer had explained about their fading bond. She watched his face as she spoke, searching for any flicker of concern, any sign that her words were reaching him. For a long moment after she finished, Damien said nothing at all, and Elena's heart sank, certain that she had failed again, that her words had simply disappeared into the same silence that swallowed everything she offered him. But then he spoke, his voice quieter than she expected, though still carrying an edge of something guarded and defensive. "You believe our bond is causing you harm," he said slowly, as though testing the words for himself. "Margaret believes it, and I have felt it myself, for months now," Elena said. "I am not telling you this to blame you, Damien. I am telling you because I am frightened, and because I do not know what will happen if things continue this way." Something shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been the beginning of concern, but before he could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and Oliver entered with urgent news that scattered the moment entirely. The scouts had spotted movement along the eastern border, unfamiliar wolves moving in formation that suggested more than a simple territorial dispute. Damien's expression hardened instantly, the king reasserting himself over whatever brief crack had begun to show in the man. "We will speak of this later," he told Elena, already moving toward the door, already shifting his focus entirely to the more immediate threat. "I promise you that." Elena watched him go, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt, somehow, louder than any slam could have been. She stood alone in the throne room, wondering if his promise meant anything at all, or if it was simply another door closing between them, disguised as a delay rather than a dismissal. She did not yet know how quickly the coming days would test that promise, or how the danger gathering at the border would soon force choices that neither she nor Damien could have imagined only hours before. 3 days passed before Damien returned to the subject he had promised to revisit, and in that time, Elena watched the castle transform around her. Messengers arrived at all hours, maps were spread across every table, and the training grounds echoed constantly with the sound of wolves, preparing for something the pack elders spoke of, only in hushed, careful tones. The unfamiliar wolves spotted at the border belonged to a rival pack led by an alpha named Gideon, a man known throughout the region for his hunger for territory and his willingness to test the strength of neighboring kingdoms before making any formal move. Elena spent those days largely alone, her conversation with Damien left unfinished, hanging in the air like a held breath. She used the time to rest as much as she could, following Margaret's advice, drinking the herbal teas the healer had prepared, trying to conserve whatever strength remained inside her. But rest did little to ease the deeper problem, the one no herb could touch, the ache in the back of her mind. The place where the bond should have burned warm and steady remained faint and flickering, like a candle struggling against a draft it could not escape. Clara stayed close during this time, filling the silence with small comforts, quiet conversation, gentle distraction, whenever Elena's thoughts drifted too far into worry. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as the two women sat together in the castle library, that Elena first noticed the tremor in her own hands, a subtle shaking that had not been present before. "Has that happened before?" Clara asked, noticing the direction of Elena's gaze. "A little," Elena admitted, curling her fingers into her palm to still them. "It's getting worse, though," Margaret said. "The fatigue would increase if nothing changed." "You should tell her about this new symptom," Clara said, concern etched clearly across her face. "I will," Elena said, though a part of her had begun to feel a strange resignation settling over her, a quiet acceptance that perhaps this was simply the path her life had chosen, regardless of what she wanted or hoped for. She pushed the thought away quickly, unwilling to let despair take root so easily, but it lingered at the edges of her mind nonetheless. That evening, word arrived that Gideon's forces had crossed further into disputed territory, close enough now that a direct confrontation seemed inevitable within days rather than weeks. The castle buzzed with barely contained tension, every corridor filled with hurried footsteps and lowered voices discussing strategy, defense, and the very real possibility of open conflict. Damien found Elena in her chambers late that night, arriving without warning for the first time in longer than she could remember. He looked exhausted, the strain of the past several days visible in the lines around his eyes, but he had come, and that alone was enough to make Elena's heart quicken with cautious hope. "I told you we would speak of this," he said, closing the door behind him. "I have not forgotten, even with everything happening at the border." Elena set aside the book she had been pretending to read and rose from her chair, unsure what to expect from this conversation, unsure whether hope was even something she should allow herself to feel. "I appreciate you coming," she said carefully. Damien ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had rarely seen from him. "I spoke with Margaret myself yesterday. She confirmed what you told me, and explained things in greater detail than perhaps you were comfortable sharing." He paused, his eyes finding hers directly for what felt like the first time in months. "She said this could become fatal, Elena." She used that word specifically. Hearing him say it aloud, in his own voice, made the reality of her situation feel suddenly sharper, more immediate than it had before. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is what she told me as well." "Why did it take you so long to make me understand the severity of it?" he asked, and though his tone was not accusing, there was a rawness in it that surprised her. "I tried to tell you," she said, unable to keep a note of old hurt from creeping into her voice. "More than once, you did not have time to listen." Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might grow defensive, might retreat back behind the walls he had built so carefully over the years. Instead, he surprised her by sitting down heavily in the chair near the window, looking suddenly much less like a king, and much more like a man carrying a weight he had refused to acknowledge for far too long. "I have not been a good mate to you," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him something significant to speak aloud. "I know this. I have known it for some time, if I am honest with myself, though I have been very skilled at avoiding that particular honesty." Elena said nothing, sensing that he needed the space to continue without interruption, something rarely afforded to him in a life spent constantly making decisions, constantly being watched and evaluated by an entire pack depending on his judgment. "After I sold," he continued, his voice quieter now, "I decided that allowing anyone close to me was a risk I could not afford to take again. She nearly cost us everything, Elena. Our security, our alliances, lives that were lost because I trusted the wrong person completely. When the bond connected me to you, some part of me simply refused to open that door again, no matter how unfair that was to you." "It was not fair," Elena said softly, but without anger, only a tired honesty that seemed to match his own. But I understand fear, Damien. I have carried my own fears through every day of these past 3 years, wondering if I would ever be enough to reach you, wondering if I was foolish for continuing to hope that I might. You were never the problem, Damien said, meeting her eyes again. I made you feel as though you were, and that is a failure I cannot undo with a single conversation. I know that, but I do not want to lose you, because I was too afraid to try. The border crisis with Gideon's pack made it impossible for them to dwell in that fragile moment for long. Within the hour, another messenger arrived requesting Damien's immediate presence in the war room, and he left with a promise that felt different this time, heavier with intention rather than obligation. Elena remained in her chambers long after he had gone, her mind turning over everything he had said, trying to decide whether real change had finally begun, or whether the pressures of the coming conflict would once again pull his attention away before anything meaningful could take root. Over the following days, small things began to shift between them, subtle at first but undeniably present. Damien began seeking her out during brief pauses in the mounting crisis, sharing pieces of information about the border situation that he would never have thought to include her in before. He asked about her health with a genuine attentiveness that surprised even Clara, who had grown accustomed to watching Elena suffer largely unnoticed. Serafina noticed the change as well, and her reaction was immediate, though carefully concealed beneath a mask of professional composure. She redoubled her efforts in the war room, making herself indispensable in matters of strategy, positioning herself as the only voice Damien could truly rely on during a time of crisis, hoping to crowd out whatever fragile reconnection had begun forming between the king and his mate. The enemy grows bolder by the day, Serafina reported during one tense meeting, her tone urgent and commanding. We cannot afford distractions right now, my king. Every resource, every moment of focus, must go toward preparing our defenses. Damien, to Serafina's visible frustration, did not entirely agree. The pack's strength includes more than our warriors and our strategies, he said, glancing briefly toward the doorway where Elena had just appeared, drawn by the sound of raised voices. It includes the bonds that hold us together, and I have neglected mine for too long to ignore it any further, even now. Serafina's expression flickered, something cold and calculating passing behind her eyes, before she smoothed it away into practiced neutrality. Of course, my king, she said. I only meant to emphasize the urgency of our situation. I understand your meaning, Damien said, and I share your urgency. But I will not repeat past mistakes, simply because the timing feels inconvenient. Elena, standing quietly near the entrance, felt a warmth spread through her chest that had little to do with the crackling fire in the room, and everything to do with the faint, unmistakable strengthening she felt in the bond, a warmth she had not sensed in longer than she could remember. It was small, fragile, easily disrupted, but it was real, and after months of feeling nothing at all, even a small flicker felt like a miracle. That night, as the castle settled into an uneasy quiet, before what everyone suspected would be a difficult confrontation with Gideon's forces in the coming days, Damien came to her chambers again, this time without any urgent news pulling him away moments later. They talked for hours, about small things and large ones, about fears neither of them had voiced aloud before, about the early days of their bond, before walls and grief and manipulation had grown up between them. It was not a complete healing, not yet, and both of them seemed to understand this without needing to say it aloud. The damage of 3 years could not undo itself in a single night, no matter how honest the conversation. But for the first time since her wolf had begun weakening, Elena felt something other than despair settling into the empty spaces inside her. She felt, cautiously, the beginning of hope. She did not yet know that the coming battle with Gideon's forces would demand more from her than any conversation could prepare her for, or that her fragile, healing bond would be tested in the most dangerous way possible before it had the chance to fully mend. The war horn sounded just before dawn, a long, low note that rolled across the training grounds and shook Elena awake before Clara even reached her door. She knew that sound. Every pack member knew that sound, and its meaning required no explanation. Gideon's forces had finally moved, crossing fully into contested territory under cover of darkness, and the kingdom's warriors were being called to answer. Elena dressed quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the simple leather garments worn by wolves preparing to fight, garments designed to be shed easily before a shift. Clara appeared moments later, her own face pale with worry, though her worry was clearly not for herself. "You cannot fight," Clara said immediately, her voice sharp with fear. Margaret was clear about the danger. "Shifting in your condition could be catastrophic." "I know what Margaret said," Elena replied, tying the last strap with steady determination, despite the fear coiling tightly in her stomach. "But I am still Luna of this pack, Clara. I cannot hide in my chambers while our warriors face danger at the border. What kind of leader would that make me?" "A living one," Clara said, gripping her arm. "Elena, please, think of what Margaret told you. Your next shift could be your last, if the bond is not strong enough yet." Elena paused, meeting her friend's eyes with a calm that surprised even herself. "The bond has grown stronger this past week. I can feel it. Faint but present. Stronger than it has been in months. Perhaps that will be enough. And if it isn't?" Clara's voice cracked slightly on the question. Elena did not have an answer for that, not one that would ease either of their fears, so she simply pulled Clara into a brief, tight embrace before hurrying toward the war room, where she knew Damien would already be organizing the pack's response to the border incursion. She found him exactly where she expected, surrounded by his most trusted warriors, Serafina positioned at his side, reviewing final troop placements on a large map spread across the table. The room fell silent for a brief moment when Elena entered, everyone clearly startled by her presence in a space typically reserved for those directly involved in battle strategy. "Elena," Damien said, straightening immediately, concern flashing across his features. "You should not be here. This will become dangerous very quickly." "I am not asking your permission to fight," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt inside. "I am telling you that I intend to stand with this pack, the same as any other wolf sworn to protect it." "Your condition," Damien began, but Elena cut him off gently. "I understand the risk better than anyone in this room," she said, "but hiding will not make me stronger, Damien. And I refuse to let fear keep me from standing beside my pack when they need every capable wolf they can find." Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly at the exchange, though whether from genuine concern or simple calculation, Elena could not tell and did not have time to consider. Damien studied her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes, torn clearly between the protective instinct that had only recently begun to reawaken in him and his respect for her right to make this choice herself. "Stay near the rear formations," he finally said, his voice rough with reluctant acceptance. "If I sense any sign of danger to you specifically, I am pulling you back immediately, regardless of what is happening on the field. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Elena said, and something passed between them in that moment, a wordless acknowledgement of how far they had come from the man who had once told a guard to simply let her cry in an empty hallway. The pack moved out just as the sun began climbing over the eastern hills, warriors shifting into their wolf forms as they crossed the training grounds, a rolling wave of fur and muscle moving with practiced coordination toward the contested border. Elena remained in human form as long as possible, riding alongside the rear formations on one of the pack's swift horses, conserving whatever strength she could, for the shift she knew would eventually become necessary. The confrontation, when it came, arrived with the sudden ferocity of a storm breaking. Gideon's forces had positioned themselves along a wooded ridge overlooking the disputed valley, and the two packs met in a chaotic clash of snarling wolves and shouted commands, the morning air filled with the sounds of a conflict neither side seemed willing to back down from easily. Elena watched from a slight distance as Damien led the charge in his massive alpha form, a wolf larger and more powerful than any other on the field, cutting through the enemy lines with a strength that reminded her, even in the chaos, why the pack trusted him so completely as their leader. Serafina fought nearby, equally skilled, her wolf form quick and precise, as she coordinated smaller groups of warriors to flank the enemy's weaker points. For a while, it seemed the battle might turn quickly in their favor. But Gideon's forces had clearly prepared more thoroughly than initial scouting reports suggested, and a second wave of enemy wolves emerged from the tree line, catching several of the pack's warriors in a dangerous pincer formation near the valley's edge. Oliver, fighting bravely among the front lines, found himself suddenly surrounded, cut off from immediate support, as three enemy wolves closed in around him. Elena did not think. She simply acted, sliding from her horse and beginning the shift before her mind had fully processed the decision. Pain tore through her instantly, sharper and more consuming than any shift she had experienced before, as though her very bones were fighting the transformation with everything they had left. She stumbled, nearly collapsing before the change fully completed. But somehow, through sheer determination, she forced her wolf form into being, feeling it settle around her like a garment 2 sizes too small. She moved toward Oliver despite the agony radiating through every part of her wolf body responding sluggishly to commands that should have come instinctively and effortlessly. She reached him just as one of the enemy wolves lunged, and she intercepted the attack, her teeth finding purchase against the enemy's shoulder, with enough force to drive it back, and buy Oliver the seconds he needed to regain his footing and fight alongside her. Together they drove the remaining attackers back, and for a brief, triumphant moment, Elena felt a surge of pride cut through the pain, a reminder of why she had refused to remain hidden away in her chambers while her pack faced danger without her. But the moment did not last. As the immediate threat cleared, Elena felt something shift wrongly inside her, a sensation unlike anything Margaret had described, a deep, resonant wrongness that spread through her entire body like ice water flooding her veins. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the churned earth of the battlefield, her wolf form flickering unsteadily, caught in some terrible space between shapes, unable to fully hold either form. Oliver's alarmed bark drew immediate attention from nearby warriors, and word spread through the battlefield with unnatural speed, reaching Damien even as he fought several yards away. He turned instantly, some instinct deeper than sound or sight, alerting him to the danger, before the message even fully reached him, and he broke away from his position, cutting through the chaos of battle with single-minded urgency, ignoring the enemy wolves that attempted to block his path. By the time he reached her, Elena's wolf form had begun to fade in and out entirely, flickering like a candle flame struggling against a wind it could not withstand, her human form threatening to emerge before she was ready, exposed and vulnerable in the middle of an active battlefield. Damien shifted back to his human form the moment he reached her, dropping to his knees beside her, without any apparent concern for the danger still surrounding them. "Elena," he said, his voice cracking with a fear she had never heard from him before, not once in 3 years of marriage. "Stay with me. Do you hear me? Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on his face, her wolf form finally settling, though weakly, into something stable enough to hold. "I had to help him," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't just watch." "I know," Damien said, gathering her carefully into his arms despite the chaos still raging around them, warriors from both packs shifting their focus momentarily to the scene unfolding near the ridge. "I know, and I am proud of you for it, but you have to hold on now. Do you understand me? Whatever strength you have left, you need to hold on to it." As he spoke, Elena felt something reaching toward her through the bond, a warmth so intense and so deliberate that it startled her, unlike anything she had felt from him in the entire duration of their marriage. It was as though he was pouring every ounce of concern and connection he possessed directly into the fragile, damaged link between them, refusing to let it flicker out entirely no matter what it cost him to keep it burning. The battlefield around them seemed to fade into background noise as Elena clung to that warmth, using it as an anchor against the darkness, threatening to pull her under entirely. She did not know, in that terrifying moment, whether it would be enough to save her, or whether she had already pushed her failing wolf beyond the point from which it could ever fully return. The battle around them continued for several more minutes, though to Elena, drifting somewhere between consciousness and darkness, time had lost all normal meaning. She was aware of movement, of being lifted, of Damien's voice issuing sharp commands to nearby warriors, but the words themselves blurred together into a distant hum she could not fully grasp. Oliver, recovering quickly from the brief skirmish that had nearly cost him his life, rallied several warriors to cover their retreat as Damien carried Elena away from the front lines, refusing to release her even for a moment, despite the obvious strain of fighting one-handed against any remaining stragglers who attempted to pursue them. Serafina, seeing the shift in the battle's momentum, took charge of the remaining forces with practiced efficiency, pressing the advantage that Gideon's forces had unexpectedly conceded when their leader, upon witnessing the chaos near the ridge, called a temporary retreat rather than risk further losses against a pack whose king had just demonstrated a terrifying willingness to abandon strategy entirely for the sake of protecting his mate. By the time they reached the castle, Word of what had happened on the battlefield had already spread ahead of them, carried by warriors returning in advance of the main group. Margaret was waiting at the entrance when Damien arrived. Elena still cradled carefully in his arms, her wolf form having finally settled back into human shape somewhere during the journey back, though she remained unconscious, her skin pale and clammy despite the warmth of the day. "Bring her to my quarters immediately," Margaret instructed, her usual calm demeanor edged with urgency that betrayed the seriousness of the situation. "I need to examine her right away." The following hours passed in a blur of activity that Elena experienced only in fragments, brief moments of awareness surfacing between longer stretches of darkness. She remembered the sharp, herbal scent of Margaret's remedies. She remembered Clara's hand gripping hers tightly, her friend's voice murmuring words of comfort that she could not fully process. And she remembered, most vividly of all, Damien's presence remaining constant throughout, refusing to leave her side, despite the many urgent matters that surely demanded his attention following the battle. When she finally woke fully, the light outside her window had shifted to the soft gold of late afternoon, suggesting she had drifted in and out of consciousness for the better part of a full day. Damien sat in the chair beside her bed, his posture suggesting he had not moved far from that spot in all the hours since they had returned, dark circles shadowing his eyes from exhaustion and worry in equal measure. "You're awake," he said, immediately leaning forward, relief flooding his expression so openly that Elena felt a small ache in her chest at the sight of it, so different from the guarded distance she had grown accustomed to over the years. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked, her voice raspy and weak. "Nearly a full day," he said. "Margaret feared you might not wake at all, at least not fully. Your wolf came dangerously close to being unable to return." Elena absorbed this information slowly, remembering the terrifying sensation of flickering between forms on the battlefield, the icy wrongness that had spread through her body as her wolf struggled against something she still did not fully understand. "What changed?" she asked. "Why did I wake?" Damien's expression grew serious, and he reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that felt entirely unfamiliar coming from him, though not unwelcome. "Margaret says the bond strengthened enough, in that critical moment, to anchor your wolf and pull it back from the edge. She says it was close, closer than she has ever seen in the few similar cases recorded in the old texts, but the connection held." "The warmth I felt," Elena said quietly, remembering the intense sensation that had reached toward her through the bond as she lay dying on the battlefield. "That was you." "I have never been more frightened in my life," Damien admitted, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Watching you flicker like that, not knowing if I would lose you before I had the chance to fix everything I had broken between us, it made me understand, in a way I had refused to understand before, exactly how much damage my distance had caused, and exactly how much I stood to lose because of my own fear." Elena squeezed his hand weakly, tears gathering in her eyes, though they felt different now. Not the tears of loneliness and rejection she had grown so accustomed to, but something closer to relief, closer to hope, carefully rebuilding itself after being nearly extinguished entirely. Margaret entered shortly after, her weathered face relaxing into a small smile at the sight of Elena awake and speaking. "How are you feeling, Luna?" "Tired," Elena admitted, "and sore in ways I did not know were possible, but alive, which I understand was not guaranteed." "It was very much not guaranteed," Margaret said seriously, moving to check Elena's pulse and examine her more thoroughly. "You pushed your wolf far beyond what was safe, shifting in your condition, especially under the strain of battle. I understand your reasons, and your bravery does you credit, but I must be honest with you both. Had the bond not strengthened at the exact moment it did, we would be having a very different conversation right now." The weight of that truth settled heavily over the room, and Damien's grip on Elena's hand tightened slightly, as though even the memory of that possibility was almost too much for him to bear. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Is the danger past, or does this remain a threat to my wolf going forward?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "The bond has strengthened significantly, more than I would have believed possible in such a short time. But your wolf has been weakened for many months, and recovery from this level of strain will not happen overnight. You must rest, avoid unnecessary shifting for the coming weeks, and continue nurturing the bond consistently. This is not a single crisis that, once survived, disappears entirely. It requires ongoing care, from both of you, to ensure your wolf fully recovers its strength." Damien nodded firmly, something resolute settling into his expression that Elena recognized as genuine commitment rather than simple crisis management. "Then that is exactly what we will do," he said. "Whatever ongoing care is required, I intend to provide it, without exception." Over the following weeks, as Elena's strength slowly returned under Margaret's careful guidance, the castle itself seemed to shift subtly around her, reflecting the changes taking place between its king and Luna. Damien began attending fewer late-night strategy sessions with Serafina, delegating more responsibility to Oliver and other trusted warriors, while he spent his evenings instead with Elena, learning things about her he had never bothered to ask before, sharing pieces of his own past that he had kept locked away for years. Serafina, watching this transformation unfold with growing frustration, made several attempts to reassert her previous position of influence, citing ongoing concerns about Gideon's forces regrouping along the border, concerns that were not entirely without merit, but that she used, transparently, to those paying attention, as an excuse to draw Damien's focus back toward herself. But Damien, having witnessed firsthand exactly what neglecting his bond with Elena had nearly cost him, remained steady in his newfound priorities, addressing pack matters with appropriate seriousness, while refusing to let them consume the entirety of his attention the way they once had. "I have failed you in so many ways," Damien said one quiet evening, sitting beside Elena on the small balcony outside her chambers, the two of them watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet. "I do not know if I can ever fully make up for the years I spent pushing you away." "You do not have to make up for the past all at once," Elena said, leaning her head against his shoulder, a gesture that would have felt impossible only weeks earlier. "You simply have to keep choosing, every day, to be present now. That is enough. That is more than enough." Damien wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than empty, filled with something warm and alive rather than the cold distance that had defined so much of their marriage. But even as their bond continued healing, strengthening with each passing day, a shadow remained on the horizon. Gideon's forces had retreated, but not defeated, and Serafina's ambitions, quietly simmering beneath her carefully maintained composure, had not disappeared simply because her influence over Damien had diminished. Both threats remained, patient and waiting, and neither Elena nor Damien could yet know how soon they would be tested again, or how much their newly rebuilt bond would need to withstand before true peace could finally be found. 3 weeks after the battle at the Ridge, Elena stood in the training grounds for the first time since her collapse, watching the morning light spill golden across the packed earth, where young wolves practiced their forms under Oliver's patient instruction. She felt stronger than she had in months, though Margaret still cautioned her against overexertion, and the bond between her and Damien had settled into something steady and warm, no longer the flickering, fragile thread it had been before. Clara joined her at the edge of the grounds, carrying 2 cups of tea, and handed one to Elena with a small, satisfied smile. "You look like yourself again," she said, "truly like yourself, not just pretending to be well for everyone's sake." "I feel like myself again," Elena admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "It is strange how much I had forgotten what that felt like, until I had it back." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, breathless from running, who delivered urgent news directly to Oliver, before the beta hurried toward the castle to inform the king. Elena felt a familiar tightness return to her chest, an instinct born from months of crisis that told her, before any words were spoken aloud, that trouble had returned to their borders once again. She found Damien in the war room within minutes, already reviewing new reports, with a focus that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the distant king she had known before, though this time his eyes flicked toward her the moment she entered, acknowledging her presence rather than dismissing it. "Gideon's forces have been spotted regrouping, closer to our territory than before," Damien said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Our scouts believe he intends a second attack, likely within days, and this time he appears to have secured additional allies willing to join his cause." "How many allies?" Elena asked, moving closer to study the map spread across the table. "Enough to concern me," Damien admitted. "Serafina believes we should strike first, before Gideon has the opportunity to fully consolidate his new alliances." "Serafina," standing at her usual position near the table, nodded firmly in agreement. Waiting only gives him time to strengthen his position further. Every day we delay is a day he uses to grow stronger. Elena studied the map carefully, her mind working through possibilities she would not have felt confident considering only months earlier, back when her voice had so rarely been sought or valued in matters of pack strategy. Striking first carries its own risks, she said slowly. If his new allies are as numerous as the scouts suggest, we could be walking directly into a trap designed to draw us out before we are fully prepared. Damien's eyes met hers, something like genuine consideration passing across his features, rather than the dismissiveness she once would have expected. What would you suggest instead? Strengthen our defenses here, along our own borders, and force Gideon to come to us, if he truly intends to fight, Elena said. Let him overextend his forces trying to breach territory we know intimately. Territory we can defend far more effectively than we could attack unfamiliar ground. Serafina's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, clearly displeased at having her strategy questioned so directly, but Damien considered Elena's words seriously, weighing them against his own instincts and the reports spread before him. There is wisdom in that approach, he said finally. We know these lands better than any invading force ever could. Oliver, gather the warriors. We will begin reinforcing the eastern and northern approaches immediately. The following days passed in a flurry of preparation, the entire pack working together to strengthen defensive positions, coordinate patrol routes, and ensure that every warrior understood their role should Gideon's forces attempt to breach their borders. Elena, though still recovering her full strength, found herself increasingly involved in these preparations, her insights valued in ways that would have seemed impossible only a season earlier. Serafina, meanwhile, grew increasingly agitated as her influence continued to wane, watching with poorly concealed frustration as Damien sought Elena's counsel with growing frequency. One evening, finding Elena alone near the herb gardens where Margaret often worked, Serafina approached with an expression that, for once, abandoned its usual careful neutrality. You have changed things quickly, Serafina said, her tone carrying an edge that had not been present in their previous, more guarded interactions. I wonder how long this newfound devotion will last, once the crisis passes and life returns to normal. Elena met her gaze steadily, refusing to allow the old insecurities to resurface at the challenge in Serafina's voice. Perhaps you misunderstand the nature of what has changed, Elena said calmly. This is not simply a reaction to crisis. Damien and I have chosen, deliberately, to rebuild what should never have been allowed to weaken in the first place. That choice does not disappear once the immediate danger passes. We shall see, Serafina said, though something in her posture suggested she had expected a less composed response, and Elena's calm confidence seemed to unsettle her more than any defensive anger could have. Not everyone believes a wolf who nearly died on the battlefield is fit to guide this pack's strategy going forward. And yet the king listened to my counsel regardless, Elena replied evenly. Perhaps that tells you something about where his priorities truly lie now. Serafina said nothing further, turning and walking away with visible irritation, and Elena watched her go, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely secure in her own place within this pack, regardless of whatever schemes Serafina might continue attempting behind the scenes. 3 days later, exactly as Elena had predicted, Gideon's forces attempted to breach the northern approach under cover of night, only to find themselves met by a fully prepared defense that had anticipated their movements with unnerving precision. The battle that followed was fierce but decisive, the pack's superior knowledge of their own territory allowing them to repel the invasion with far fewer losses than the previous confrontation at the ridge had cost them. Elena did not shift during this battle, respecting Margaret's continued caution about overexertion, but she remained present throughout the conflict, coordinating supply lines and communication between different defensive positions with a competence that impressed even the pack's most seasoned warriors. Damien fought at the front lines as always, but this time, knowing Elena remained safely behind the main defenses rather than risking herself unnecessarily, he fought with a clarity of focus that had been noticeably absent during the chaos of their previous encounter. By dawn, Gideon's remaining forces had retreated in full disarray, their attempted invasion having cost them far more than they had anticipated, and word soon reached the castle that Gideon himself had been wounded during the confrontation, forcing his allies to reconsider the wisdom of continuing their aggression against a pack so thoroughly prepared to defend itself. The following weeks brought a fragile but genuine peace to the borders, as Gideon's coalition, weakened and demoralized, withdrew to reconsider their ambitions elsewhere. Within the castle itself, a different kind of peace began settling as well, one built not on the absence of external threat, but on the presence of something that had been missing for far too long, a genuine partnership between King and Luna, built on honesty, mutual respect, and a bond that grew stronger with each passing day, rather than fading further into cold silence. Elena stood once again at her chamber window one quiet evening, watching the moonlight silver the training grounds below, remembering the countless nights she had stood in this exact spot feeling utterly alone, despite being surrounded by an entire castle full of people. The memory no longer carried the same sharp pain it once had, transformed instead into a reminder of how far she and Damien had traveled together, from a marriage defined by neglect to something that finally felt like the true partnership the ancient bond had always intended for them to build. Damien joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against the top of her head. "You seem thoughtful tonight," he observed. "I was remembering how this used to feel," Elena said softly, leaning back against him. "Standing here alone, wondering if things would ever change between us." "I am sorry it took me so long to understand what I was risking," Damien said, his voice carrying genuine remorse that no longer needed to be questioned or doubted. "But I am grateful, more than I know how to properly express, that you gave me the chance to change before it became too late." "We still have work ahead of us," Elena said, turning in his arms to face him directly. "Rebuilding trust does not happen overnight, even when both people are committed to trying." "I know," Damien said, brushing a gentle hand along her cheek. "But I intend to keep showing up for that work, every single day, for as long as it takes, and for as long as we both shall continue building this life together." Elena smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that had become increasingly natural over these past weeks, and pressed closer against him, feeling the steady warmth of their bond pulsing between them, no longer fragile or uncertain, but strong, resilient, and finally, truly alive. Outside, somewhere beyond the castle walls, Serafina watched the lit window from a distance, her ambitions not entirely extinguished despite the setbacks she had faced, though even she recognized, with growing frustration, that the bond she had once hoped to exploit had grown far too strong now to be easily broken. Whatever plans she might still harbor for the future, she understood that the easy path she had once envisioned had closed entirely, replaced by a King and Luna who had finally, after years of pain and distance, chosen each other completely. And within the castle, safe within Damien's arms, Elena felt her wolf stir contentedly, for the first time in longer than she could remember, no longer weak or fading, but strong, whole, and deeply unshakably alive, a living testament to the truth that even the most broken bonds could be rebuilt, given enough courage, enough honesty, and enough willingness from both hearts to finally, truly, reach toward each other.